What?
Welcome to ConCon, Consciousness Conversations. I'm DR.
And I'm Ben.
We are consciousness enthusiasts coming to you live from the Science of Consciousness Conference 2023 in Taormina, Italy. And it was a big day today.
It was a long day. It's a very long, big, varied day with lots of ideas thrown at us.
I took an incredibly large number of notes from maybe half of the things that we saw. Half of the things sort of really struck me, and then half of them were kind of missable / problematic / I don't know.
I'm noticing in my notes I have a section entitled Microtubules, and I just left it completely blank.
Well, maybe we should start there.
Microtubules?
Well, we could start with that because so the morning session was all quantum stuff, and I had some elucidating understandings, which is this guy Travis Craddock presented. His stuff was actually kind of interesting. He talked about how what is it, phenylethylamines?
Phenylethylamines, yeah.
Yeah, psychedelic things actually bind to microtubules. And then Stuart Hameroff, who is the founder of this conference and an anesthesiologist and stuff, we learned his whole history with consciousness, which is that he and Roger Penrose are kind of the fathers of this whole quantum movement. So it's no surprise that this consciousness conference is like very heavily influenced by all of this quantum stuff. And he gave a long presentation that was very intense. And
we touched on the quantum aspect in our last episode where we said that people were debunking it.
Yeah. And that kind of...
So people were bunking it this time.
Yeah. I mean, although Jim Al-Khalili, who spoke yesterday, also spoke, his bits were... he was sort of saying like, yes, we think that, quantum effects... So quantum effects being that like the same types of mechanics that we see at play in an electron have influence in a cell. And yesterday he sort of presented that it seems like if there should be quantum effects in the way DNA divides or recombines, and it doesn't. Like it seems like the cells have figured out a way to avoid them, basically.
To suppress the quantum effect, specifically tunneling, because it would cause mutations when DNA splits. And
so I said during the session I had this moment where a light clicked on for me of like the quantum thing, and I said like, I think I could maybe steelman their argument a little bit.
Let's hear it.
So I think that I would say that what they're saying that, so I think the quantum stuff is inherently, and at the end of his presentation, he was like, very much not trying to hide this, is very much like a panpsychist type view, even though they might eschew that label, where they say that like quantum effects are primarily conscious and that consciousness arises from those things and that the hard problem goes away. I think I had a quote from him about it.
Honestly, well, maybe I'll let you continue your steelman. I was confused by that, specifically where they fell on the sort of the panpsychist.
Yeah, because it seems to me like they're very that like because quantum stuff feels underneath or before kind of matter or life or whatever, that you have experience because you have consciousness because of this thing. But I think what they're sort of saying is that there are all sorts of interesting things happening inside of a neuron that are more complex than just like a binary action potential of that neuron firing or not. And some of this data seems to be getting stored in these microtubules, things like memory, or like there's like more complexity in the way a neuron is firing than maybe has met the eye in the past, right? And so it's like, consciousness, right? And I think, so to me, that's the steel, and that sort of like this orchestration of quantum effect is maybe happening beyond a single neuron or beyond an area of a microtubule, and that quantum movement is like moving throughout the brain somehow as an orchestration of consciousness. To me, this seems, and based on all the other debunking folks, this seems like quite far-fetched in terms of the quantum effects being the primary mover. And to me, it makes more sense that like there's so much complexity inside of a neuron that is helping it decide what to fire, when to fire. And then the neuron is kind of capping that complexity in a binary trigger, right? And then clusters of neurons and then the whole brain also have like similarly huge complexity. And he actually makes a comparison to this that if you added up all the microtubule connections or whatever inside of a neuron, they are about the same as the number of connections between neurons in a brain as like two parallel structures. And so my sense was, but anyway, my takeaway was that like, this seems like an unnecessary level of abstract, like thinking about the neurons is still probably the most valid level to think about.
Yeah. Okay. A few things
for our purposes.
For one, I feel like these people, if you called them panpsychists, would shudder with horror. I have a feeling. It wasn't super clear, but I have a feeling that they say that they think they're distinct.
And we've talked about panpsychism before, which is basically, and there's a lot of panpsychist stuff at the conference this time. Panpsychism is basically just like everything is conscious, every electron, every rock, and we are just manifestations of that.
Yeah, and I guess Hameroff sort of had this story where he's watching Penrose do something really special with some sort of unifying math thing, and Penrose basically says something about consciousness needing like really small scale, really high hertz oscillations or something like that. And he's like, I know, I have just the thing for you. It's microtubules, which, as you say, is sort of this like structure embedded inside neuronal cells.
And this was the beginning of his real core interest in consciousness, I think. Hameroff, he was like an anesthesiologist grad student or something, anesthesiology grad student. And so like he's been riding this horse for a really long time. Yeah,
one thing that I find really strange and I hadn't seen before is they're trying to create like EKGs that run up to like terahertz scale, which is, I mean, in the computer industry, that is not a term that ever gets thrown around, right? Like it kind of stops at gigahertz.
Well, and a normal EKG is what? Were they saying like tens of hertz?
Yeah, yeah.
So this would be like an order of what, a million or something?
No, more. I mean, so tera is like
mega is 1,000. Gigas.
Mega's a million, or it's 10 to the 20. Or wait, no, 10. I don't know. We had to look it up. It's like a very large number.
An incredibly large number of hertz.
Think about like, kilobyte is 1,000, megabytes million, gigabyte is a billion, and I guess terabyte is the next one. Yeah. So that's big. That's a lot. That's very fast. And I don't understand, although they kept making the point that anesthesia sort of deadens those super, super fast resonance frequencies. Yeah. But I have no basis whether to know that is like, I have no background in that, so I can't say if it's.
Yeah, the feeling that I got. In one level I was like compelled more than in the past, where it seemed like this is just throwing a mystery at a mystery. I'm like, okay, they're doing some hard science about the microtubules and stuff, and there seems to be some activity that's happening there. On the other hand, this sort of feels like jumping to quantum mechanics and relativity, overstepping, say, like classic Newtonian physics, which are super useful for doing a lot of basic calculations. Like, I'm interested from a consciousness level of understanding like why the ball rolls down a hill, not why the superpositions of the electrons in that ball do certain things at certain times.
I mean, I guess to echo kind of what you said before, if you kind of want to find a spookiness in the brain, maybe even a spookiness that's only in the human brain or in highly evolved mammals. And that sort of seems like the driving factor for a lot of this stuff. Wouldn't it be great if we could find that magical secret sauce that only is in these resonant frequencies in the human brain tissue and nowhere else, and that explains everything, that's spooky and magical about consciousness, because we found the spooky bit, All
right, well, on the total flip side of this, probably.
On the other side of the fence.
Why don't you introduce Anil Seth and his stuff?
Yeah, so he gave a keynote. I just was blown away. I feel that. Do you think these will be posted? These talks? It was definitely recorded.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
worth watching. I don't know how similar it is to any of his other recent talks or like his TED talk. But yeah, reality is a controlled hallucination. What we experience, the quality of what we experience originates from within. It is a model of sort of the things that are going there out in the world. By the time they get to us, they sort of cross modes into electrical impulses. So we're making sense of just electricity in the brain, and we're hallucinating a whole rich world. But it's all happening inside of us, right? And of course, it can also be mistaken, right? We have optical illusions where no matter what anyone tells you about how this optical illusion works, that these two color patches are actually the same, or the dress is red or blue and gold or whatever. You're not going to see it any differently than you did before because that mental model is very sticky. And it's based on this really, really sticky prior that you've built up over your whole life.
And these are so powerfully demonstratable. Like he did a bunch on the screen, the classic ones that you've seen, the dress that Ben mentioned that some people think is black and blue. You thought it was black and blue, right? I see it as white and gold. After I had been learning about some of this, I was playing this game, Breath of the Wild, and it's an open world game, and the guy is adventuring around, and there's like things that sparkle a little bit. And it'll be like, oh, this is like a little shrub that you can collect, or here's like a mushroom that you can cook later. And it's like important items. Like you can't do that to everything in the game, but certain things like sparkle. And I was like, oh, and I just was like thinking about tying this to like, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's like sort of like life when you explore, but that's so silly. I mean, things kind of sparkle that are important to you. And then the more I started paying attention to my own experience, I was like, this is exactly how I pay attention to the world. They don't sparkle, but like I'm noticing things that are important and they're like standing out very loudly because I have this bottom up like background perception going. It's like, hey, if you see that thing that's really important to you, recognize that logo, see that, the face of that celebrity that you know on a magazine or whatever, you're constantly like screening for those things and they're jumping out.
Yeah, I thought he made, he had a few big points. He's number one, I think he's good at branding. He's very eloquent, charismatic. He's a good speaker. And one of his sort of brandings that I think is genius is to create something called the real problem.
Yeah.
To contrast Chalmers' hard and easy problems. And basically the real problem is sort of, let's go beyond the neural correlates of consciousness, the easy problem, and let's find sort of causal or mechanistic explanations, functional explanations, phenomenological explanations that can connect sort of neuronal firing patterns and actual qualitative experience. Which, you've read the book. I think it's an interesting question to say, like, what even is, how do you even go beyond statistical correlation into like actual functional mapping? I think that creates a very, like, not hard as the hard problem hard, but it's still a hard problem. But at least maybe it seems more tractable.
Well, and I think that you can study each of these problems like, faces popping out from clouds at you or whatever as individual systems. So he contrasts, and I think we talked about this in the podcast a couple times ago, a quote from this article that he had written about this, but he compares this to the study of the nature of life, vitalism, and that, eventually people just sort of stopped talking about what makes something alive or not because they'd broken down what it meant to be alive into all of these subsystems of digestion and cognition, reproduction, whatever. And so that we can kind of break these subsystems down in ways that will be meaningful and, elucidating in such that the hard problem would disappear.
Evaporate in a puff of metaphysical smoke, I think is what he said. He wrote a funny paper. I love this title, The Strength of Weak IIT. So he kind of disregarded IAT, but then said, well, actually, a weaker form might actually be useful because we do metrics, right?
Yeah. IIT is integrated information theory, which we've talked about a few times.
Yeah. So, I think he made a lot of important points, and I think the biggest standout thing to me was how fruitful the line of reasoning is. There's sort of like, once you start asking the right questions, I feel like there's all this low-hanging fruit that you can run experiments, run simulations, and quickly learn a lot of things. So I feel like he's tugging on the right thread. He's asking the right questions, it's very clear to me to see this because, well, his research has been super fruitful, right? And he has this, lab that's just going crazy with this like really cool stuff.
Yeah, and of course, Stuart Hameroff came up to like badger him with a question and basically be like,
Well, yeah, so like, yeah, Anil Seth was like, vitalism is dead. No one believes that crap anymore. And Hameroff goes up. He's like, well, actually, I'm a quantum proto-vitalist, so like, it's not dead. I'm still vitalist.
And he's like, he was like, consciousness came first, and he's like, well, I think we're on different sides of this or something. It was very diplomatic.
He's like, we're on different sides of the fence. I think it was a very polite way to say, like, agree to disagree.
So I think there were some good nods today. Sometimes there's this sense of, consciousness kind of being preeminent, of like humans somehow being, we like reached the moment to like to allow this conscious energy that had already existed to flower into existence or whatever. And I think there were a lot of great discussions today about like the evolutionary value of consciousness, which again like rebuts the hard problem, which would say that like, why do we have any reason to be conscious at all? It's like, well, it's really helpful to survive, to like be conscious in the way that we're conscious. And so the next talk was,
well, just to linger on that, like, yeah, I guess inherent in the zombie argument is that there's no functional use for consciousness, right? That's how a zombie can be a zombie, because consciousness it's an epiphenomenon, right? It sits on top, has no functional use. And I think Anil Seth is saying, well, wait a second, like, there's clear advantages to having consciousness, having the experience of quality and so forth.
Yeah, so which I think dovetails perfectly into this Nicholas Humphrey talk. So I'm kind of surprised I had not heard of this guy, because I looked at his book list and it was really impressive. He's at Cambridge, and he's got a brand new book called am I saying it right? Sentience.
Yeah, Sentience.
Sentience.
Sentience. Sentience. Let's go with that.
And this is some like a very meaningful line of thought that I've tried to push myself through many times, which is like thinking about the need for cognition from like the single cell, very primordial state up through to like how humans would use it, right? And so he had some like really cool examples and diagrams of like, you're this organism and you like, let's say you just have a boundary, and parts of that boundary are getting stimulus that it wants and parts of that boundary are getting stimulus that it doesn't want. And it sort of figures out how to respond at the local site. And eventually it can behave and interact much better as an organism if that becomes centralized, right? And that is sort of, that centralization is sort of a form of consciousness. Hopefully I'm doing him justice here. And then there's a third layer of that, which is allowing for cognition to happen about the cognition, right? Sort of like meta awareness about that consciousness that becomes like the sentience.
I will say one thing. Also, like, I think you might need to be speaking more into the
mic.
Yeah. One thing he did say that I didn't really understand was these attractor states, like when he's talking about this metacognition stuff. I don't understand what that's about, but the rest of it I thought was great. And he lingered on a lot on this blind sight thing, right?
Yes.
Which I guess he worked on way back in the 70s.
Yeah. He had video from the 70s, which was really impressive, of this monkey that had blind sight.
Yeah. And talk about it like a nice fruitful thread to pull on, right? I think so. Blind sight is basically, there's two pathways in the brain, right? And one of them is very ancient. One of them is very modern in terms of evolutionary timescales. And if you sever the modern one, you can still navigate and not bump into things, but the person will be blind. The person, the confabulator will be blind, right? If you ask that person, can you see? They'll be like, no, I can't see anything. You throw a ball at their head and they'll dodge out of the way. And then you say, well, how did you do that? And be like, I don't know, I just guessed that something was coming after me. And so the you that has senses does not. It's empty, it's black.
Yeah.
But still you're able to see some other aspect of you that's not conscious. And so this is a very interesting thing to sort of piece apart, right? Because it tells you a lot of very interesting things about like what consciousness is and does and what it is not. Right?
Yeah, and some of this stuff about hemispheric neglect and blind sight I think we talked previously was some of the most interesting stuff that kind of got me excited. This is similar to like the split brain studies. You have something that's going on that's not available to your phenomenological experience, your conscious experience, but that is part of your experience as an animal. So I think in the end, he made some, for this audience, quite provocative statements, which was, I think a interesting thing with this crowd, probably more interesting. We were going to talk about the different, there's a survey they sent out to everyone at the conference to sort of pick their favorite theories, which we had not heard of most of these.
Yeah, there's like 18 of them, some of them with pretty incredible names.
I think a more interesting thing might actually be to survey everybody on like who is conscious, does consciousness go to like an electron? Is it an ant? Is it a turtle? Is it a monkey? Is it like, I think everybody there would have a spot where they're like, this is conscious and above, and this is conscious and below. And then probably also like people have different opinions about
this guy's line in the sand, I do think was pretty spicy. He basically was saying, birds and mammals, everything else, not so much. To be clear, I guess we should be clear. He did make a distinction between cognitively conscious and sentient.
Yeah.
And his mind, sentience is cognitive consciousness plus subjective experience, aka qualia.
Yeah.
And he's basically like, humans have it, your dog has it. That frog over there, no, it is basically just reacting. It has, a control center, but it's not like experiencing any subjective taste when it eats that fly, right? It's just doing it. In the same way, this monkey that had its modern optical nerve or whatever cut, it could pick up grapes, but it was just like the frog, like reactively, like eating a fly, and the monkey was tasting the grape but not seeing the grape, and the frog neither sees nor tastes the fly.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of his line in the sand that I'm sure riled up a lot of people. But I kind of love when people throw out their spicy takes.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the things that makes this conference awesome. And I definitely going to read his new book. I was really impressed by this guy.
He made a statement that he thought part of the way that this evolved was through being warm-blooded, because there's something about temperature that allows you to have more neuronal transactions per second. I don't know. Yeah, I'm very excited to read the book. What else do we want to talk about?
Yeah, well, I will point out something about this distinction, which I hadn't really heard before, between the cognitive conscious and sentient. I think that actually adds back in some wiggle room for these zombies, right? Because you could say, well, a zombie is cognitively conscious, right? It's like metacognating and stuff, but it's not feeling any of that. There's no subjective experience, right? I think the only issue is that, again, why are they such liars? Right?
Well, I think the metacognition is the sentience, right? Like I think you'd have to be not reflective, totally mechanistic. I think you couldn't behave like a human.
Are you saying this on behalf of what you think, or what you think he thinks?
I think. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And I think he would agree.
Well, he did mention, so he showed like an amoeba.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, it's sort of reacting to external stimuli.
Yeah.
And they said, but it's better actually if it has a control center and it forwards the sort of the stimuli sort of in a different form to the control center, and then determine if you want to do that reaction or not. Yeah. That I considered and then he drew a loop onto that, right?
Yeah.
That loop inside the control center is kind of like the metacognition. It's
but that's what he was saying was.
Oh, I don't think so. Because then he mentions that there was 100 generations of human evolution. So he thinks there's proto-humans that actually were not sentient.
Well, I guess we'll have to read the book.
We'll read the book. We'll read the book.
And come back, yeah. All right. So the next talk I liked a lot better than you did.
Yeah.
He was... I thought he was a philosopher, but then he kept saying he wasn't a philosopher.
I think everyone kept saying, well, as a philosopher, and he's like, no, I'm not a philosopher.
But what I thought was really interesting was he said that people talk about the unity of conscious experience, and it's this like one, amazing like unified thing, and the one best thing you can say about it is that it's like so like specific and like indivisible. And he's like, maybe it is kind of actually divisible. And he sort of started breaking down chunks of phenomenal experience, and he talked about something specific to color, and I didn't actually quite understand the study that he talked about, but it's something about 3x3 matrices and like
that's when I sort of jumped off the ship.
Okay.
Mentally. I think where he started I thought was really good. So he basically was saying, okay, Thomas Nagel said, what is it like to be a bat? Is it, and then he sort of defined consciousness as, it is something that it is like to be something. And this guy, this not a philosopher guy, Kevin, was complaining that how non-scientific that question is. I think that was kind of Nagel's point, actually, that there's no science that could get at this. But then he was saying, well, wait a second, let's like at least come up with a clear definition that could lead to experimentation, some sort of scientification about what is it like to be anything. And he used human adults, squeezing sponges, and other things. And then when he got to the color experiment, I just tuned out. Because I think at a certain point, like, this not a philosophy guy, like, it's just so many definitions all the way down that I start to lose the plot.
Well, the matrix thing I thought was interesting because he was all that was trying to do was saying that you could inject some objectivity into a subjective experience, that like people seeing red are seeing things within some sort of like a color space that was sort of somewhat objective. I think that's what he was trying to get at. But it was mostly just a warm-up example for, looking at, he had this graph and it was sort of like control of information flow and the speed of information. And that he had different types of things in different vectors there. So in the top you had knowledge, in the bottom you had things that you don't experience. So knowledge was like proprioception, which was kind of controversial. Like people had weird thoughts about that.
Anil Seth had some thoughts about that.
And then he had like, blood pressure and digestion is not experienced. And then you had occurrent experiences, which were like taste, smell, vision. And then states, which were like hunger, sadness, happiness. And he's like, it's not important where these things are on the graph. It's more important that like they could be placed somewhere and like quantified and put within a specific space. And I think like I kind of like this idea of the thinking about our emotions as like an API into our, like the way an API is like something a software developer would use to connect to a protocol or connect to an outside program. And so, if I've got these positive types of emotions that certain signals can send tracks down, and I've got these negative emotions that other ones can use, and those are the levers that essentially my body can pull to try and get my brain to notice things, and that those are evolved and somewhat consistent. I just thought it was interesting to try and
which by the way kind of leads into the next one, which I think that's the correct take on emotions, right? And the next guy seemed to paint a picture that mood.
You're skipping over the other guy who was really not memorable, but
it's so memorable I didn't write a single thing about him. Sorry, guy.
The mood one we can skip straight to that because that was like he was talking about the consciousness of mood and that like you're in a bad mood, but it's for no reason, and I'm like, I think it might be for a reason.
I think there's reasons for that. I mean, this guy was a philosopher, proudly.
Yeah.
And he says some poetic things, I thought. Mood is the air in which experiences take place. Mood suffuses all experience. I think that is interesting to think about. I think it's true. But this is how you just define emotions, basically. It applies a sort of a valence to all possible decisions or actions you might take, which is why emotion causes you to act in one way and not another way.
Yeah.
And of course, your mood, insofar as it changes your qualitative subjective experience, is pretty interesting, but it's definitely doing that to move you in a certain direction, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe I misunderstood. Again, it was so like, philosophy as just definitions of propositions.
And I was kind of hoping that there was a deeper message there. I mean, it was sort of like the title was just mood consciousness, and like moods represent our. It didn't feel like it had a message or a directive or like.
Well, like I do think there was a message that I just totally disagreed with, which was that like. When you lump all the positive valence moods and emotions, that's happiness. And then all the negative ones, that's unhappiness. And I just think, why would you do that?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I also think, it's not like the end goal to be happy all the time. I think it's to have meaning is what drives most people.
Yeah.
Right. But even that's arguable. But to just cleave things into happiness, unhappiness.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's a weird dichotomy, and it didn't really resonate with my terahertz frequencies.
Yeah. Your quantum orchestration is
my quantum
orchestration
was not good.
Do we want to say anything about the?
Yeah. So I do actually. We went to so these were the keynotes and plenaries. They were amazing. These guys were. And they're mega qualified, really insightful stuff. Then we went to do they have papers attached to these? Went to the small sessions.
Some of them. I don't like.
Yeah. And we went to the one on machine consciousness. I was very excited about this, being an AI researcher. And I just didn't find much of value.
Yeah.
I was hoping, I guess, it'd be a room full of AI researchers is the thing, right?
Yeah.
People sort of like me, and it was like more people from outside AI looking in. And I think giving takes that just either I thought were just wrong or I thought weren't in a useful direction.
Yeah, and I saw this last year a bunch. It's this is such a wide tent of a field, and you've got people that I really like, deep thinkers in this space. Somebody like Julia Tononi, who's referenced a ton of times, like hasn't been to this conference that I know. Maybe used to come back in the day. You have a lot of a wide tent of thinkers in this space, and it attracts like people interested from all over the place. One of the guys who presented was just his label was like as an independent researcher, and he's just like a guy who likes to write about stuff. I mean, and he came and gave a presentation and was sort of, I don't know, not super well thought out. And I think there's just I think you could be an independent researcher and do good work. Oh, absolutely.
But
yeah.
I think that the variance in the mean probably of independent researchers, their work is probably higher variance and lower mean. I think just being at an institution, being around other people is helpful for the sort of the constant implicit peer review of are you on the right track or not?
Yeah. So, it was like a bunch of titles that sounded interesting, and I would say again, not a lot of like takeaways necessarily.
Yeah, it almost seemed like they were interesting talks that at some point would be like, oh yeah, wait, this is a machine consciousness session, so let me throw in a slide that it has really murky points relating into all the rest of the things I just said. But that being said,
do you think that these papers were lumped together as
that's
after
a great
the
question,
fact,
actually.
or did they apply to be in the machine consciousness
Yeah.
session? That'd be an interesting thing to find out.
Maybe they all got mislabeled by some area chair. And they're like, oh crap, I'm in the machine consciousness section.
Or they just had a group of people and they're like, I guess we'll call this machine. Because if you look down the list of other of these concurrent sessions, they're all, one of them's just called the hard problem.
Yeah.
So
that could make sense.
Quantum approaches, panpsychism.
But I will say this about the day. I think just from the keynotes and the plenary sessions alone, I got my money's worth from the cost of registration.
So I mean, I think we might go a little easy on the concurrent sessions if the rest of the week, but there is a whole one on psychedelics on Friday, which I'm pretty stoked about. So, last year there was a lot of psychedelic sessions, psychedelic content. Maybe it was more of like people in the States. There's a lot of interest in that, but less. I'm noticing less of that this year. More stuff about quantum stuff, and what was the other thing that? A lot
AI.
A lot of
ChatGPT
AI
gets name dropped almost every hour.
Cool. Should we call it there?
I think we should call it.
All right, day 2. Thanks for joining us. You can follow along the podcast at concon.show.
Or meet us in Taormina.
Yeah.